Millionaire visits wife's grave after 8 years and finds girl crying on the tombstone. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The autumn air carried a somber chill as Andrew Collins walked the familiar stone path through Harbor View Cemetery. His tailored charcoal suit contrasted sharply with the vibrant fall foliage surrounding him, almost as if the world refused to mourn alongside him. It had been 8 years since he'd lost Elizabeth. 8 years of building his tech empire into a billion-dollar corporation, while his personal life remained frozen in time. Andrew clutched a bouquet of white lilies, Elizabeth's favorites, their perfume mingling with the earthy scent of fallen leaves. Each step toward her grave marker felt heavier than the last. He'd made this pilgrimage annually, though the ache in his chest hadn't diminished with passing years. Success, wealth, power, none of it filled the void Elizabeth had left behind. As he approached the familiar marble headstone, Andrew stopped abruptly. A small figure knelt before Elizabeth's grave, a little girl with auburn hair tied in a messy ponytail. She wore a thin jacket too light for the October weather, her shoulders trembling as she placed wildflowers beside the headstone. Andrew hesitated, confused by the child's presence. In 8 years, he'd never encountered anyone else visiting Elizabeth's grave. She'd been estranged from her family and they'd never had children. Who was this girl and why was she here? "Excuse me," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. The girl turned quickly, her eyes widening as she scrambled to her feet. Tear tracks marked her cheeks, but her posture was defensive, chin raised, despite her obvious distress. Andrew was struck by her eyes, hazel with flecks of gold, startlingly familiar in a way that made his chest tighten. "I didn't steal anything," she said immediately, backing away from the grave. "I just came to talk to my mom." The words hit Andrew like a physical blow. "Your mom?" "This is my mom's grave," the girl insisted, pointing at the marble marker. "Elizabeth Collins, that's my mom's name." Andrew stared at the child, blood rushing in his ears. "That's not possible," he managed. "Elizabeth was my wife." The girl's expression shifted from defiance to confusion. "Your wife?" "No, you're lying. Mom never said she had a husband." Andrew knelt down to meet her at eye level, his mind racing. The girl looked to be about 8 years old. Elizabeth had died 8 years ago. The timing couldn't be coincidental, and those eyes, they were unmistakably Elizabeth's eyes. "What's your name?" he asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Grace," she replied cautiously. "Grace Wilson." Wilson, Elizabeth's maiden name. Andrew felt as though the ground beneath him was shifting. "She was all I had," Grace said suddenly, her voice breaking. "After she died, there was nobody. I've been in foster homes and shelters. Today's the only day I could come see her." Andrew's throat constricted. Was it possible? Had Elizabeth kept a child from him? Why would she have kept Grace a secret? He'd thought their marriage was solid, built on love and trust. The idea that Elizabeth had maintained a separate life with a daughter he never knew existed seemed unfathomable. "Grace," he said gently, "I didn't know about you. Elizabeth, your mother, never told me she had a daughter." The girl studied him warily. "She never told me about you either." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver locket. This was hers. She gave it to me right before she died. Said I should always keep it safe. Andrew recognized the locket instantly. He'd given it to Elizabeth on their first anniversary. He'd had it engraved with their initials, yet here it was in the hands of this child he'd never known existed. "May I see that?" he asked. Grace hesitated before placing it in his palm. Andrew turned it over and saw the familiar inscription, E&A, always. His fingers trembled as he returned it to her. "I gave this to your mother," he said, "a long time ago." Grace's eyes widened. "So you really knew her?" "I thought I did," Andrew replied, the weight of Elizabeth's deception pressing down on him. "But now I'm not so sure." A gust of wind swept through the cemetery, causing Grace to shiver in her thin jacket. Andrew noticed her worn sneakers and the frayed edges of her jeans. His heart twisted at the thought of Elizabeth's daughter, his wife's child, living in shelters while he resided in a mansion with more rooms than he could use. "Where are you staying tonight, Grace?" he asked, already knowing he couldn't leave her alone. Grace looked away. "The shelter on Maple Street, if there's room." Andrew made a decision then, one that would alter the course of both their lives. "Would you like to come with me just for tonight? We could talk about your mother. I think we both have questions that need answers." Grace studied him skeptically. "How do I know I can trust you?" It was a fair question, more mature than any 8-year-old should need to ask. Andrew reached into his wallet and showed her his driver's license. "My name is Andrew Collins. I was married to Elizabeth Collins for 5 years before she died. I own Collins Technologies on the east side of the city. You can call someone to verify who I am if you want." Grace considered this, then nodded slowly. "Okay, just for tonight, and just because I want to know more about my mom." As they walked together toward the cemetery gates, Andrew felt a storm of emotions. Grief rekindled, betrayal, confusion, and something unexpected. A strange sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for 8 years. What he didn't know then was that finding Grace wasn't just about discovering Elizabeth's secrets. It was the beginning of a journey that would teach him the true meaning of family, and reveal dangers neither of them could have anticipated. Andrew's sleek Mercedes felt like a spaceship to Grace. She sat rigidly in the passenger seat, her small backpack clutched tightly to her chest like armor. The leather seats were softer than any bed she'd slept in for years. "Are you hungry?" Andrew asked, breaking the uncomfortable silence. Grace nodded cautiously. "A little." They stopped at a diner near the cemetery. Andrew watched as Grace meticulously cut her pancakes into tiny pieces, eating slowly as if savoring every bite. The methodical way she handled her food spoke volumes about a life of scarcity. "How long have you been in foster care?" Andrew asked gently. "Since Mom died." Grace kept her eyes on her plate. "I stayed with our neighbor at first, then different homes. Some were okay, some weren't." Andrew's throat tightened. While he'd been drowning his grief in work and wealth, Elizabeth's daughter had been struggling through the system. "Did your mother ever mention me?" he asked, the question that had been burning inside him. Grace shook her head. "No, she said it was just us against the world." Her eyes, so much like Elizabeth's, met his. Why would she lie to both of us? It was the question Andrew couldn't answer. After dinner, they arrived at Andrew's mansion in Westlake Hills. Grace stood in the marble foyer, her worn sneakers and patched jacket a stark contrast to the crystal chandeliers and imported furniture. "You live here alone?" she asked, her voice echoing in the vast space. "Yes," Andrew replied, suddenly seeing his home through her eyes, beautiful but empty. "I'll show you to the guest room." The guest bedroom, bigger than any apartment Grace had shared with her mother, overwhelmed her. She perched on the edge of the king-sized bed, still clutching her backpack. "The bathroom's through there," Andrew said awkwardly. "There should be new toothbrushes in the drawer." Grace nodded, not meeting his eyes. "We'll figure this out tomorrow," Andrew promised. "Try to get some sleep." Alone in his study, Andrew poured himself a scotch with shaking hands. He opened his laptop and pulled up old photos of Elizabeth, his beautiful, brilliant wife who'd apparently led a double life. In one photo, taken at a charity gala, she wore the very locket now hanging around Grace's neck. A soft sound made him turn. Grace stood in the doorway, wearing an oversized t-shirt he'd given her to sleep in. "I couldn't find the light switch," she said quietly. "Second panel on the right," Andrew replied. "Are you okay?" Grace nodded, then hesitated. "That's really my mom? With you?" Andrew turned the laptop so she could see. "Yes, that's Elizabeth, my wife." Grace approached cautiously, studying the photo. "She looks happy." "She was," Andrew said softly. "At least I thought she was." "She was happy with me too," Grace said, a hint of defensiveness in her voice. Their eyes met in silent acknowledgement of the impossible truth they both faced. The woman they'd loved had kept them secret from each other. leaving them to piece together her mystery after she was gone. Andrew woke at dawn, momentarily disoriented, by the sound of movement in his usually silent home. The events of yesterday crashed back, the cemetery, Grace, Elizabeth's staggering deception. He dressed quickly and found Grace already awake, sitting at the kitchen island, examining a framed photo of Elizabeth. "You're up early," he said, starting the coffee maker. "I'm always up early," Grace replied. "Mom said early risers get ahead, start on life." Andrew smiled sadly. "She used to tell me that too." After a simple breakfast of toast and eggs, Grace ate methodically, saving half for later until Andrew gently explained she could have more. Andrew made a decision. "Grace, I want to understand what happened. I'm going to hire someone to help us figure this out." He paused. "Would it be okay if you stayed here while we sort things out? I don't want to send you back to another shelter." Grace studied him with Elizabeth's calculating gaze. "Why are you helping me?" "Because you're Elizabeth's daughter," Andrew answered, honestly, "and because no child should be without a home." Later that morning, Andrew called Marcus Reed, a private investigator he'd used for corporate background checks. "I need absolute discretion," Andrew explained after outlining the situation. "This isn't just business, it's personal." "Understood," Marcus replied. "I'll start by verifying Grace's birth certificate and tracking Elizabeth's activities under both names." When Andrew hung up, he found Grace exploring the living room, examining the collection of art on the walls. "Mom liked paintings too," she said, "but nothing this fancy. We had prints she'd find at thrift stores." Andrew approached, noticing the way Grace delicately touched the frame of a small watercolor landscape. "Elizabeth painted this one," he said. Softly, Grace's eyes widened. "Mom painted? She never told me she could paint." Another piece of Elizabeth hidden away from each life she'd led. That afternoon, Andrew took Grace to buy necessities: clothes, shoes, toiletries. She approached each purchase with careful consideration, checking prices, selecting only the most practical items. "What about this?" Andrew held up a purple sweater with subtle sparkles. Grace shook her head. "It's not practical." "But do you like it?" Andrew pressed gently. Grace hesitated, then nodded slightly. "Then we're getting it," Andrew said, adding it to their cart despite her protests. Back at the mansion, Grace carefully arranged her new belongings in the guest room. Andrew watched from the doorway, struck by her methodical nature, so like Elizabeth in her precision, yet with a caution that spoke of hard-learned lessons. "I have some work calls to make," Andrew said. "Will you be okay on your own for a bit?" Grace nodded, already absorbed in organizing her new possessions. In his office, Andrew's first call wasn't work-related at all. "I need information on Elizabeth Wilson, also known as Elizabeth Collins," he explained to Marcus. "Specifically, I need to understand how she maintained two separate lives." "I'm on it," Marcus assured him. "This won't be easy, but if there's a paper trail, I'll find it." After hanging up, Andrew stared at Elizabeth's photograph on his desk. Who had she really been? And more importantly, what dangers might her secrets have created for the child she left behind? A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Grace stood in the doorway, holding something in her small hands. Elizabeth's locket. "I can't get it open," she said. "Mom said there was something important inside, but it's stuck." Andrew felt a chill run down his spine. Perhaps the locket contained the first key to unlocking Elizabeth's secrets. Andrew examined the silver locket, carefully turning it over in his hands. The clasp appeared normal, but it wouldn't budge despite his efforts. "Your mother always loved puzzles," he told Grace. "She'd encode birthday cards and create treasure hunts for gifts." Grace's eyes brightened. "She did that for me too. On my birthdays, she'd hide little presents around whatever apartment we were staying in." This shared memory created a momentary connection between them, a small bridge across the chasm of Elizabeth's deception. Andrew studied the locket more closely, noticing a barely perceptible seam along its edge. "I think there might be a hidden mechanism," he said. Applying gentle pressure to opposite sides simultaneously, he felt a soft click. The face of the locket slid sideways, rather than opening conventionally. "You did it," Grace exclaimed, leaning closer. Inside wasn't a photograph as expected, but a tiny micro SD card. "What is it?" Grace asked. "It's a memory card," Andrew explained, "for storing digital information. Your mother wanted to keep it safe." "Can we see? What's on it?" Andrew hesitated. "We'll need my computer. But Grace, I don't know what's on here. It might be complicated." In his office, Andrew inserted the micro SD into an adapter. His computer recognized it immediately, revealing a single encrypted file labeled Insurance PDF and a text document named Read First TXT. Andrew opened the text file first. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. This file contains information that could be dangerous in the wrong hands. The password is the name of where we first met, followed by the date, MMDDYY. Trust no one." Andrew felt Grace watching him intently. "Do you understand it?" she asked. "I think so." He typed Metropolitan Museum 92210 into the password field. The file unlocked, revealing financial records, photographs, and scanned documents. "What is all this?" Grace asked, squinting at the screen. Andrew scrolled through the file, a cold realization settling over him. "Your mother was tracking illegal activities, money laundering, art theft, connected to someone named Victor Lancaster." Grace stiffened beside him. "I know that name," she whispered. Mom would get scared whenever it was on TV. Once she saw him at a distance in a restaurant, and we moved to a different city the next day. Andrew continued scanning the documents, finding newspaper clippings about Lancaster's trial for financial crimes. Elizabeth had highlighted one critical detail. Lancaster would be released from prison after serving 8 years, this month. The implications hit Andrew like a physical blow. Elizabeth hadn't just been hiding Grace from him. She'd been hiding both of them from something far more dangerous. His office phone rang, startling them both. It was Marcus. "I've got preliminary information," the investigator said. "Elizabeth Wilson's identity appears to have been created about 9 years ago. Before that, she may have been living under a different name entirely." "Witness protection?" Andrew asked, connecting the dots. "Possibly," Marcus replied. "I'll keep digging." After hanging up, Andrew found Grace watching him with worried eyes. "Are we in trouble?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Andrew made a decision then, to protect this child at all costs, regardless of the secrets that had brought them together. "I won't let anything happen to you," he promised. "We're going to figure this out, together." For the first time since they'd met, Grace didn't look skeptical. Instead, she nodded, a fragile trust beginning to form between them. Sleep eluded Andrew that night. He paced his home office, reviewing the encrypted files on the micro SD card. Elizabeth had meticulously documented Victor Lancaster's criminal enterprise, art forgeries used to launder money, offshore accounts, blackmail. More disturbingly, she'd noted suspected connections between Lancaster and several high-ranking officials. One document detailed Elizabeth's original identity: Catherine Wells, an art authenticator who had unwittingly discovered Lancaster's forgery scheme. Her testimony had helped convict him 8 years ago, right before she died and became Elizabeth Wilson. A sound from the hallway made Andrew look up. Grace stood in the doorway, barefoot in her new pajamas. "I had a bad dream," she admitted. "About Mom." Andrew gestured to the leather sofa. "Want to talk about it?" Grace sat, tucking her feet beneath her. "We were running from something. Mom kept looking back, scared." She fiddled with the locket around her neck. "That happened a lot in real life, too." "Your mother was very brave," Andrew said. "She was protecting you." "From that man, Lancaster?" Andrew nodded. "She testified against him. That's why she changed her identity, why she became Elizabeth." Grace processed this. "So, she wasn't really Elizabeth Collins or Elizabeth Wilson?" "She was both and neither," Andrew explained gently. But whoever she was before, the person we knew, that was real. Morning brought a development. Marcus called with news. Lancaster was released 3 days ago. And there's something else. A black sedan has been circling your neighborhood since dawn. Andrew's security system alerted him to movement at the front gate. The cameras showed a man in a delivery uniform with a package. I didn't order anything, he told Grace, who joined him for breakfast. Stay here. Andrew approached the security monitor and used the intercom. Leave it at the gate. The delivery man looked directly at the camera. Package for Grace Wilson. A chill ran through Andrew. No one should know Grace was here. We need to leave, he told Grace, who was already grabbing her backpack, survival instincts kicking in. Right now. They exited through the garage, taking Andrew's least conspicuous vehicle, a dark blue SUV. As they pulled onto the street, Andrew spotted the black sedan parked a block away. Keep your head down, he instructed Grace, who complied without question. Where are we going? She asked, her voice remarkably steady. Somewhere safe. Andrew replied, executing a series of turns to ensure they weren't followed. I have a cabin upstate that no one knows about. Elizabeth and I bought it through a shell corporation. Grace's eyes widened slightly. Mom took me to a cabin once. For my birthday, we went hiking and made s'mores. Andrew glanced at her. Was it near a lake, with a red door? Grace nodded slowly. You think it's the same place? She must have taken you to our cabin, Andrew realized. Another connection. Another shared piece of Elizabeth they'd each held separately. As they drove north, leaving the city behind, Andrew called Marcus from a burner phone. We've been compromised. I need you to access Elizabeth's safety deposit box at First National. The key is in my office safe. Whatever you find, secure it and go dark. After hanging up, Andrew noticed Grace watching him intently. Are we in danger? She asked directly. Andrew considered lying to protect her, then thought better of it. She'd had enough deception in her young life. Yes, he admitted. But we're going to be okay. Your mother left us everything we need to handle this. Grace nodded, a determined expression replacing fear. Mom always said I was stronger than I knew. Looking at this resilient child, Elizabeth's daughter, Andrew believed it. Whatever dangers lay ahead, they would face them together. The cabin appeared through the trees as Andrew turned down a gravel drive, its red door a welcoming beacon against the weathered wood exterior. Grace pressed her face to the window, recognition dawning in her eyes. It is the same place, she whispered. We came here when I was 6. Andrew parked behind the cabin, concealing the SUV from the main road. We should be safe here. Few people know about this place, and it's not in my name. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. A great room with a stone fireplace, small kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a loft. While Andrew secured the doors and windows, Grace wandered the space, running her fingers along the familiar wooden furniture. Mom let me sleep in the loft, she said, pointing to the ladder leading to the cozy space above. Said it was like my own private treehouse. Andrew smiled sadly. She always loved that loft. Would you like to stay there again? Grace nodded, her first genuine smile emerging, small but significant. As evening approached, Andrew prepared a simple dinner while Grace explored the cabin's surroundings under his watchful eye. She returned with pine cones and colorful leaves, arranging them carefully on the windowsill. Mom called this our treasure collection, she explained. Natural things that don't cost anything but are still beautiful. During dinner, Andrew's satellite phone rang. Marcus calling from a secure line. I got the contents from the deposit box, Marcus reported. Documents, another data drive, and a letter addressed to you. I've secured everything at the location we discussed. Also, Lancaster's been making inquiries about Elizabeth Collins, visiting her old office at the museum. He's looking for something, Andrew concluded. Maybe evidence she collected against him. There's more, Marcus continued. Elizabeth had a life insurance policy naming Grace as beneficiary, but the money's been held up in probate because there's no guardian designated. After ending the call, Andrew found Grace sitting cross-legged before the fireplace, sketching the cabin interior with remarkable skill for her age. "You're an artist like your mother," he observed, sitting beside her. Grace shrugged. "Mom taught me, said it was important to notice details others miss." Andrew studied her drawing, the precise rendering of wood grain, the accurate proportions. That's exactly what she would say. She believed art was about seeing truth beneath the surface. Grace looked up at him. Is that how she caught the bad man? By seeing things others missed? "I think so," Andrew replied, piecing together Elizabeth's story. She had an eye for authenticity, what was real and what wasn't. Grace considered this, then asked the question Andrew had been avoiding. "What happens when they find us?" Her directness startled him. "What makes you think they will?" "Mom said they always find you eventually. That's why we had to keep moving." She returned to her drawing, adding shadows with careful strokes. "She'd be packing our bags right now." Andrew felt a surge of determination. "We're not running anymore, Grace. Your mother spent years gathering evidence against Lancaster. We're going to use it." "How?" "Tomorrow, Marcus will bring everything from the safety deposit box. Then we'll find someone trustworthy to help us. Someone who can make sure Lancaster goes back to prison." Grace studied him, searching for conviction in his eyes. Finding it, she nodded slowly. "Mom would have liked that," she said finally. She was tired of running. That night, as Grace slept in the loft above, Andrew sat vigil by the fireplace, Elizabeth's wedding photo in one hand, his phone in the other. He was no longer just a grieving widower or a successful businessman. He was a protector now, guardian of the most precious legacy Elizabeth had left behind. The morning sun filtered through pine trees, casting dappled light across the cabin floor. Andrew had dozed off in the armchair, waking with a start at the sound of movement above. Grace peered down from the loft, her hair tousled from sleep. "You didn't go to bed," she observed. "I wanted to keep watch," Andrew replied, stretching his stiff muscles. Grace climbed down the ladder with practiced ease. "Mom used to do that too. Said she slept better knowing I was safe." The simple observation created another connection between them, another thread in the tapestry of understanding they were weaving about Elizabeth. While preparing breakfast, Andrew received a text from Marcus. "Package secure? Meeting at noon. Possible surveillance on main road. Use caution." "Change of plans," Andrew told Grace. "We need to be careful going to meet Marcus. I think someone might be watching the area." Instead of fear, Grace's expression showed resignation. "There's a back trail through the woods," she offered. "Mom and I used it once when a strange car parked near the main road." Andrew stared at her, astonished once again by Elizabeth's foresight and Grace's matter-of-fact resilience. "Show me," he said. After breakfast, Grace led Andrew through the forest behind the cabin to a narrow trail that eventually connected with a service road. They hiked for 30 minutes before reaching a small diner where Marcus waited in a nondescript sedan. "I wasn't followed," Marcus confirmed, handing Andrew a sealed envelope. Inside was a USB drive, legal documents, and a handwritten letter addressed to Andrew. He pocketed everything, unwilling to examine it in public. "What did you find at Lancaster's end?" Andrew asked quietly. "He's been liquidating assets, making large cash withdrawals," Marcus replied, acting like a man preparing to disappear, or someone planning something big. Back at the cabin, while Grace sketched outside, close enough for Andrew to watch through the window, he read Elizabeth's letter with trembling hands. "Andrew," it began, "if you're reading this, my worst fears have been realized. I never wanted to deceive you, but separation was the only way to protect both you and Grace from Victor Lancaster. Before we met, I witnessed him murder a business associate. My testimony sent him to prison, but his organization remained intact. They never stopped looking for me. The evidence on the drive proves Lancaster's criminal enterprise continued operating during his imprisonment. It's insurance, leverage to keep us safe if he ever found us. Take it to Federal Agent Diana Chen. Her contact information is enclosed." She was the only one who believed Lancaster's reach extended into law enforcement. I'm sorry for the pain my deception caused. Loving you wasn't a lie. Creating a life with Grace wasn't a lie. The only falsehood was pretending they could exist separately. If you found Grace, please protect her. She's strong, but she's still a child who's lost too much. She deserves a home, stability, love. All the things I tried but failed to give her. I never expected our worlds to collide, but perhaps together you can build something beautiful from the ruins of my mistakes. With eternal love, Elizabeth. Andrew folded the letter, emotion threatening to overwhelm him. He looked out the window, at Grace, this resilient child who carried Elizabeth's eyes, talent, and courage. A decision crystallized in his mind. He would not just protect Grace, he would give her the home Elizabeth had wanted for her, the family she deserved. But first they needed to neutralize the threat Lancaster posed. Outside, a twig snapped in the forest beyond where Grace sat sketching. Andrew was at the door in seconds, every sense alert to danger lurking at the edges of their temporary sanctuary. Andrew pulled Grace inside the cabin, locking the door behind them. He moved quickly to the windows, peering through the curtains at the surrounding forest. "What's wrong?" Grace asked, clutching her sketchbook against her chest. "I heard something," Andrew replied, keeping his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "It might be nothing, but we need to be careful." Grace nodded, immediately moving away from the windows, a practiced response that spoke volumes about her life with Elizabeth. She retreated to the kitchen table where she could still see Andrew but wasn't visible from outside. "Should we run?" she asked quietly. Andrew shook his head, retrieving the handgun he'd stored in a locked cabinet. "Not yet. This could be a false alarm." He positioned himself by the window again, scanning the tree line. A movement caught his eye, a flash of dark clothing between pines. Not a hiker or forest ranger, someone moving with purpose, trying to stay concealed. Andrew's satellite phone vibrated. "Marcus, Lancaster's men are on the move," Marcus warned. "They tracked the SUV's GPS. You need to leave. Now." Andrew cursed himself for not disabling the vehicle's tracking system. "How many?" "At least 3 headed your way. Local contacts spotted them. At the gas station asking about the cabin. You've got maybe 20 minutes." After ending the call, Andrew turned to Grace, who watched him with solemn understanding beyond her years. "We need to go," he said. "Pack only what you absolutely need." Grace was already moving, grabbing her backpack and efficiently filling it with essentials. No panic, no questions, just immediate action. Elizabeth had trained her well. Andrew collected the USB drive, the letter, and other crucial documents, securing them in a waterproof pouch. He checked his weapon and grabbed emergency supplies, water, energy bars, first aid kit. "The back trail," Grace suggested as she rejoined him. Backpack ready, Elizabeth's locket securely around her neck. "There's a fork that Mom showed me. One path leads to the road, the other goes deeper into the woods to an old ranger station." Andrew nodded, again struck by Elizabeth's thoroughness in preparing Grace for danger. "The ranger station it is. We can regroup there before finding another way out." They slipped out the back door, moving quickly into the sheltering forest. Grace led with confidence, navigating the trail as if she'd walked it yesterday rather than years ago. They had covered perhaps half a mile when the distant sound of breaking glass reached them, someone forcing entry into the cabin. "Faster," Andrew whispered, placing himself between Grace and the sounds of pursuit. They reached the fork in the trail, and Grace pointed to the less visible path veering left. As they followed it, Andrew heard voices behind them, men calling to each, other discovering their absence. The old ranger station appeared ahead, a small wooden structure partially reclaimed by nature. Andrew ushered Grace inside, quickly assessing the single-room building for exits and defensive positions. "What now?" Grace asked, her breathing controlled despite their hurried escape. Andrew checked his phone. No signal this deep in the forest. "We wait until dark, then circle back to the service road. Marcus has a contact who can extract us safely." Grace nodded, sitting cross-legged on the dusty floor, her back against the wall. She showed no tears, no complaints, just the quiet acceptance of someone accustomed to crisis. "You're very brave," Andrew told her softly. Grace shrugged. "Mom said being scared is okay, but you can't let it stop you from doing what needs to be done." "Your mother was the bravest person I ever knew," Andrew replied. "She protected both of us, in her own way." As daylight began to fade, Andrew checked the surrounding area. No signs of pursuit. They'd successfully evaded Lancaster's men, at least temporarily. "We should go soon," he told Grace, who had been silently sketching in the dim light. "Stay close to me, and if anything happens, remember, run to safety, and use the code word when we meet again." Grace finished. "Mom taught me that too." In that moment, Andrew made a silent promise to Elizabeth. Her daughter would not only survive this danger, she would thrive beyond it, with the stability and love she deserved. Darkness enveloped the forest as Andrew and Grace moved silently away from the ranger station. The night air carried a chill that penetrated Grace's light jacket, but she never complained, keeping pace with Andrew's careful steps. They navigated, by moonlight filtering through the trees, Andrew constantly pausing to listen for pursuers. Grace matched his movements instinctively, freezing when he stopped, moving when he moved, like a synchronous dance they'd somehow rehearsed. "The service road should be about half a mile ahead," Andrew whispered, consulting the compass on his watch. "There's a big fallen tree just before it," Grace added. "Mom and I used it as a landmark." Andrew marveled again at how clearly she remembered details from years ago, a survival skill Elizabeth had instilled in her. When they reached the service road, Andrew sent a prearranged signal to Marcus from his satellite phone. 3 brief pulses. The response came quickly. A vehicle would meet them at the designated extraction point in 20 minutes. They walked along the road's edge, staying within the tree line for cover. Grace's small hand found Andrew's in the darkness, a gesture of trust that tightened his resolve. "Almost there," he assured her. Headlights appeared in the distance, a vehicle approaching slowly with its lights dimmed. Andrew tensed, pulling Grace deeper into the forest cover until he could confirm it was their extraction. The car stopped at the precise coordinates. A woman emerged, not Marcus, but someone Andrew recognized immediately from Elizabeth's documents. Federal Agent Diana Chen. "Stay here," he instructed Grace. "If I say paintbrush, come out. If not, run back to the ranger station." Grace nodded, squeezing his hand once before releasing it. Andrew approached cautiously, hand near his concealed weapon. "Marcus sent you?" "Marcus is compromised," Chen replied tersely. "Lancaster's people intercepted him an hour ago. He managed to call me first." Andrew felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "How do I know I can trust you?" Chen's expression remained impassive. "Elizabeth said you proposed at the Metropolitan Museum, where a guard caught you on one knee in the medieval gallery after hours. She kept the security incident report because she thought it was romantic, a detail so intimate, so specific to their relationship that only Elizabeth could have shared it." Andrew relaxed slightly. "Paintbrush," he called over his shoulder. Grace emerged from the trees, approaching warily. "You must be Grace," Chen said, her voice softening. "Your mother spoke of you often." "I'm Diana." Grace looked to Andrew for confirmation before responding. "You knew my mom? I helped her when she first testified against Lancaster. I've been watching over both of you from a distance ever since." They quickly entered Chen's unmarked SUV. As they drove away from the forest, Chen briefed them on the situation. "Lancaster knows about the evidence Elizabeth gathered. He's desperate to find it before you can use it against him. My superiors don't believe the threat is credible. Lancaster has powerful friends in the Bureau. That's why Elizabeth trusted only me. We have everything she collected," Andrew said. "USB drive, documents, financial records, enough to send Lancaster back to prison." Chen nodded grimly. "We need to get it to a judge I trust. But first, we need to get you somewhere safe. Lancaster's men will be watching all your properties as well as standard safe houses." "Where are we going?" Grace asked, speaking for the first time since entering the vehicle. Chen glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Somewhere your mother prepared years ago, a contingency plan she hoped she'd never need to use. As they drove through the night, Andrew reached back to squeeze Grace's hand reassuringly. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, bound not by blood but by their love for the remarkable woman who had connected them. The pre-dawn light cast a grayish hue over the modest farmhouse nestled among rolling hills. After hours of driving on back roads, changing vehicles twice, Chen finally pulled onto a gravel driveway that disappeared into a stand of maple trees. "This is it?" Andrew asked, surveying the isolated property. "Elizabeth purchased it through multiple shell companies," Chen explained. "It's untraceable to either of her identities." Grace peered through the window, her expression unreadable. "I've never been here before." "She set it up as a final retreat," Chen said. "She hoped you'd never need it." Inside, the farmhouse was simple but fully equipped. Stocked pantry, generator, medical supplies, and communications equipment. Everything necessary for an extended stay off the grid. "Your mother was nothing if not thorough," Andrew murmured, as they explored the space. Grace wandered through the rooms, stopping abruptly in what appeared to be a child's bedroom. The walls were painted soft yellow, with a small bookshelf filled with children's titles and a desk by the window. On the bed lay a stuffed elephant, worn with age. "Mr. Trunks," Grace whispered, picking up the toy. "I thought I lost him when we moved from Chicago." She hugged the elephant to her chest, the first genuine display of childlike behavior Andrew had witnessed from her. Chen nodded knowingly. "Elizabeth brought your favorite things here, creating a space that would comfort you if the worst happened." While Grace explored her room, Chen briefed Andrew on their next steps. "Lancaster's influence runs deep, but I have a federal judge who will review Elizabeth's evidence. The problem is getting it to him securely. Lancaster has people watching. Official channels." "How long until we can move?" Andrew asked. 3 days. I need to arrange secure transport and verify the judge's security hasn't been compromised." After Chen left, promising to return with supplies, Andrew found Grace sitting at the kitchen table, sketching the view from the window. "Are you okay?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. She nodded without looking up. "Mom planned all this," she said. Not a question, but a realization. She knew exactly what might happen. "Your mother was always thinking ahead." Andrew agreed. "It's what made her such a brilliant curator. She could see connections others missed." Grace set down her pencil, finally meeting his gaze. "Why did you stay? You could have just given the evidence to Agent Chen and gone back to your normal life." The question caught Andrew off guard with its directness, but he knew she deserved honesty. "At first I stayed because I needed answers about Elizabeth," he admitted, "then because you needed protection." He paused, searching for the right words. "Now it's because I care what happens to you, Grace. Not just because you're Elizabeth's daughter, but because you're you." Grace studied him intently, searching for truth in his expression. After a moment, she nodded slightly, seemingly satisfied with what she found. "Mom would have liked that you're helping me," she said finally. "She always said good people were rare but worth finding." That evening, as Grace slept in her yellow room, Andrew examined Elizabeth's evidence more thoroughly. Alongside financial records and damning photographs were personal notes, Elizabeth's private thoughts about the double life she'd been forced to create. One passage struck him deeply. "Grace asked for a forever home today. The guilt is overwhelming. Andrew talks about starting a family. While my daughter dreams of stability, I cannot provide either of them. As long as Lancaster lives, I must keep these worlds separate, though it breaks my heart daily." Andrew closed the journal, a renewed determination settling over him. Lancaster had stolen Elizabeth's chance at a complete life. He wouldn't let the man take anything more from Grace. 2 days passed at the farmhouse in relative calm. Grace settled into a routine, spending mornings exploring the property, always within Andrew's sight, and afternoons drawing or reading books Elizabeth had selected years before. Andrew found himself studying Grace's mannerisms, discovering echoes of Elizabeth in her focused concentration, in the way she tilted her head when considering something carefully. Yet Grace was uniquely herself, more direct than Elizabeth had been, with a practical resilience born from years of uncertainty. On the morning of the third day, Chen arrived with supplies and news. "The judge is ready," she told Andrew as they unpacked groceries. "We move tomorrow at dawn." Grace sat at the kitchen counter, pretending to read but clearly listening to every word. "Lancaster's men attacked Marcus in custody," Chen continued. "He's in critical condition but secure. They're desperate to find the evidence." Andrew glanced at Grace, concerned about discussing such matters in front of her. "I can handle it," she said, reading his expression. "Mom never hid the dangerous stuff from me. Said pretending bad things weren't happening didn't make them go away." Chen nodded approvingly. "Your mother was right. And you should know, we found something in Lancaster's communications. He may have had an informant close to Elizabeth near the end." "Someone betrayed her?" Andrew asked, tension tightening his shoulders. "Possibly," Chen confirmed. "We don't know who, but it explains how Lancaster tracked her movements before her death." Grace closed her book. "Is that why she got sick? Because someone betrayed her?" Chen hesitated. "Your mother had a heart condition, Grace, but the stress of hiding certainly didn't help." Later, while Chen secured the perimeter, Andrew found Grace in her yellow room, organizing a small collection of colored pencils with methodical precision. "Are you okay?" he asked. That was a lot to take in. Grace continued arranging pencils by color gradient. "Mom always said someone was watching. I thought she was just being careful." She looked up at Andrew. She was right. Andrew sat on the edge of the bed. "Your mother was very smart. That's why she left us the evidence and prepared this place. She was always one step ahead." "Not at the end," Grace said quietly. At the end, she was too tired to run anymore. The simple observation cut through Andrew's defenses. He remembered Elizabeth in their final months, how she'd seemed distracted, occasionally exhausted. He'd attributed it to her work, never imagining she was maintaining another life, battling a heart condition, and staying vigilant against threats. "I think," Andrew said carefully, "that your mother made a choice. She knew she couldn't run forever, so she created a different kind of protection for you. The evidence against Lancaster, this safe house, even connecting with Agent Chen." Grace considered this. "Do you think she meant for us to find each other?" Andrew hadn't considered this possibility before. Had Elizabeth, in her final days, contemplated bringing her two worlds together? "I don't know," he answered honestly. "But I'm glad we did." Grace nodded, returning to her pencils. After a moment, she spoke without looking up. "If we stop Lancaster, what happens next? To me, I mean." The question carried weight beyond its simple words. A child who'd known nothing but temporary arrangements, asking about her future. Andrew took a breath, making a decision he realized had been forming since that first day in the cemetery. "That depends," he said. "I was hoping you might consider staying with me, permanently." Grace looked up, her expression guarded but hopeful. "You mean adoption?" "Yes," Andrew said simply. "If you'd want that." Grace didn't answer immediately, but something shifted in her eyes, a cautious light kindling where there had been only practical resignation before. "I'll think about it," she said finally. But the small smile that followed spoke volumes. Dawn broke, with a heavy mist shrouding the farmhouse. Andrew had barely slept, alternating between checking security systems and reviewing their extraction plan. In the dim light of early morning, he found Grace already awake, dressed in layers as instructed, her backpack ready beside her. "You're prepared," he observed. "Always," she replied simply. Mom's rule number 1. Chen arrived precisely on schedule. Her government-issued SUV replaced by an inconspicuous sedan with tinted windows. "Change of plans," she announced tersely. "My contact at the bureau says Lancaster's men are watching the courthouse. We need a different approach to reach the judge." As they loaded into the car, Andrew noticed Grace clutching something tightly. Her mother's locket, now empty of its secret but still precious as a connection to Elizabeth. "The judge has agreed to meet us at his brother's fishing cabin," Chen explained, as they drove. It's off the books, secure. We'll present the evidence there. Andrew studied their surroundings carefully, noting that Chen was taking an unusually circuitous route. We're being careful? He asked. Lancaster has informants everywhere, Chen replied. Trust no one but me. The phrase triggered something. In Andrew's memory, Elizabeth's note had contained those exact words, trust no one. A cold unease settled in his stomach. They drove for over an hour, moving deeper into isolated countryside. Grace sat silently beside Andrew in the back seat, her posture alert despite her calm expression. As they turned onto a narrow dirt road, Andrew noticed something odd. Chen had removed her service weapon from its holster and placed it beside her on the seat. Is there a problem? He asked quietly. Just a precaution. Chen answered too quickly. Grace tugged Andrew's sleeve gently, an almost imperceptible movement. When he glanced down, she was holding her sketchbook open to a fresh photo. Written in small, neat letters were the words, Mom never trusted her completely. Andrew's pulse quickened. He looked up to find Chen watching them in the rearview mirror. Everything okay back there? She asked. Fine, Andrew replied evenly. Just wondering how much further. Not far, Chen said, turning down an even narrower track that disappeared into dense forest. The car slowed as they approached a small clearing where another vehicle was parked, an expensive black SUV with tinted windows. No judge's modest cabin, no judicial proceedings awaiting them. That's not the judge, Grace whispered. Chen stopped the car and turned to face them, her expression hardening. Give me the evidence now and this can end peacefully. You're working for Lancaster, Andrew stated, the betrayal crystallizing. Lancaster has reach you can't imagine, Chen replied. Elizabeth never understood that. Fighting him is futile. Andrew's mind raced. They were isolated, outnumbered, with a traitor literally in the driver's seat. But they still had one advantage. Chen didn't know they'd discovered her deception until now. The evidence isn't with us, Andrew lied smoothly. It's in a secure location, set to be delivered to multiple federal agencies if we don't check in. Hourly, Chen's expression flickered with uncertainty. You're bluffing. Elizabeth was always thorough, Andrew countered. Did you really think she wouldn't have contingencies? From the black SUV, two men emerged. One clearly security, the other an elegantly dressed older man with silver hair and cold eyes. Victor, Lancaster, bring them out, Lancaster called. Chen reached for her weapon, but Andrew was faster. In one fluid motion, he unlocked the door behind him and pushed Grace out, following immediately after. Run, he shouted, as Chen scrambled from the driver's seat. Grace darted toward the trees with the speed and agility of someone who had practiced escaping danger. Andrew followed, positioning himself between her and their pursuers. Gunshots cracked through the forest air. Andrew ducked, pulling Grace deeper into the protective cover of pine trees and undergrowth. Keep moving, he urged, guiding her through the forest as shouts and footsteps followed behind them. Lancaster had found them, Chen had betrayed them, but Andrew was determined that this wasn't the end. Elizabeth had prepared for everything, including the possibility that they might need to disappear completely. And now, running through unknown woods with Grace's hand firmly in his, Andrew finally understood exactly why Elizabeth had created her double life. Not just from fear, but from love. The fierce, protective love that he now felt for her daughter. The forest swallowed them as Andrew and Grace pushed deeper through the underbrush. Behind them, shouts and occasional gunfire punctuated the woodland silence. Andrew maintained a steady pace, careful not to move too quickly for Grace while ensuring they kept distance from their pursuers. We need to find a road, Andrew whispered, pausing behind a fallen tree to catch his breath and check their surroundings. Grace nodded, her face flushed, but composed. There's a highway sound coming from that direction, she pointed east, where the faint rumble of distant traffic was barely audible. Andrew had never been more grateful for Grace's heightened awareness, another survival skill Elizabeth had cultivated in her daughter. They moved eastward using natural cover when possible. Andrew's phone had no signal, and Chen had confiscated his satellite phone before their departure. They were truly on their own. "If we reach the highway, we can flag down help," Andrew said, trying to sound confident for Grace's sake. "Lancasters, men will be watching the roads," Grace replied matter-of-factly. "Mom always said busy public places are safer than empty roads when someone's looking for you." Andrew adjusted their course. "Then we'll find a town or service station, somewhere, with witnesses." After an hour of careful navigation, the trees thinned, revealing a 2-lane country road. Across it stood a small diner with a gas station, its parking lot half filled with trucks and cars. "Perfect," Andrew murmured. "Listen carefully, Grace. We're going to walk in there like normal people stopping for lunch. Find the restroom, clean up, then join me at a table. If anything feels wrong, anything at all, use the back exit and run to those trees over there. Understand?" Grace nodded solemnly. "What's our code word?" "Paintbrush," Andrew confirmed. "And if we get separated, remember the contingency plan from the farmhouse." Elizabeth had established an emergency protocol, a lawyer in the city who held documents that would ensure Grace's safety if Andrew couldn't protect her himself. They crossed the road quickly and entered the diner separately. Inside, the warmth and smell of fried food created an almost surreal contrast to the danger they'd just escaped. Normal life continuing, oblivious to their crisis. Andrew selected a booth with a clear view of both exits, ordering coffee while watching for Grace. She emerged from the restroom minutes later, face washed, hair smoothed, looking remarkably composed for a child who'd just fled gunfire. She slid into the booth across from him. "I'm calling for help," Andrew told her, borrowing the diner's phone to make a collect call to his corporate lawyer. "Richard, it's Andrew. Activate Protocol Cypress immediately." "Yes, it's that serious. We're at." He glanced at a menu to confirm. Their location. Hillside Diner off Route 17, hurry. Protocol Cypress was an emergency contingency Andrew had established years ago for corporate crises, a private security team, untraceable to his public assets. "Help will be here in 40 minutes, Andrew told Grace after hanging up. "We just need to stay safe until then." They ordered food, neither wanted to maintain appearances. Grace nibbled at her sandwich, her eyes constantly scanning the diner's entrance. "What happens after?" she asked quietly. "Even if we get away today, Lancaster won't stop." Andrew reached across the table, covering her small hand with his. "We have the evidence. Once we get it to the right people, real federal agents, not Chen, Lancaster will go back to prison." "And then?" Grace persisted. Her real question hung, unspoken between them. "And then," Andrew said firmly, "we figure out our life together. If you still want that." Grace nodded, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "I do." The bell above the diner door jingled. Andrew tensed, but it was just a truck driver entering. Still, the sound had reminded him of their vulnerability. Every minute they remained increased the risk of discovery. "I think we should," Andrew began, but stopped as Grace's expression suddenly changed, her eyes widening at something behind him. "They found us," she whispered. Through the reflection in the window, Andrew saw 2 of Lancaster's men entering the diner, trying to appear casual as they scanned the customers. "Stay calm," Andrew murmured. "When I say now, slide under the table and go out the back. I'll create a distraction." Grace shook her head. "We stay together." "Grace, Mom already left me once," she said fiercely. "I'm not losing you too." The simple declaration struck Andrew to his core. In that moment, he wasn't just Elizabeth's widow protecting her child. He was the father Grace had claimed him to be. "Okay," he agreed. "Together." As Lancaster's men approached their table, Andrew made a decision that would alter the course of everything that followed. Andrew placed his coffee cup down deliberately, making eye contact with Grace to ensure she was ready for whatever came next. She gave a barely perceptible nod, a child who had learned to communicate in silences and subtle gestures. As Lancaster's men approached, Andrew did something unexpected. He raised his voice, addressing the diner at large. "Excuse me, everyone. I need your attention." The sudden announcement froze the approaching men in their tracks. Diners looked up, curious. "I'm Andrew Collins, CEO of Collins Technologies. These men have been following my daughter and me. They're working for a convicted criminal named Victor Lancaster." Murmurs spread through the diner. One of Lancaster's men reached inside his jacket but stopped when a burly truck driver stood up. "You threatening a kid, mister?" the driver asked, crossing his arms. The diner's manager emerged from behind the counter. "I've already called the sheriff," she announced. "He'll be here in 5 minutes." Lancaster's men exchanged glances, clearly recalculating their odds. The public exposure had completely altered the situation. "This isn't over," one muttered before they retreated, exiting the diner quickly. The diner erupted in concerned questions. Andrew kept Grace close as he explained a simplified version of their situation, careful not to reveal too many details, but ensuring everyone understood they were in genuine danger. "Sheriff Donovan's good people," the manager assured Andrew. "He'll help you." 20 minutes later, Andrew and Grace sat in Sheriff Donovan's office, explaining their situation to both the sheriff and 2 FBI agents who had been stationed in the nearby town investigating an unrelated case. "Agent Chen has been under internal investigation for months," one of the FBI agents confirmed after verifying the evidence Andrew presented. "We suspected she had outside connections but couldn't prove it. Lancaster has a network of people in official positions," Andrew explained. "That's why Elizabeth, my wife, couldn't trust the normal channels." Sheriff Donovan, a weathered man with kind eyes, offered Grace a soda from his office refrigerator. "You've been mighty brave, young lady." Grace accepted the drink with a polite thank you, staying close to Andrew's side. "We'll need to get you both to a secure location while we process this evidence," the FBI agent said. "Lancaster is still free, and he'll be desperate now that we have his entire operation documented." "How long will it take?" Andrew asked. 2. "Build a case this comprehensive? A few days at most. Elizabeth's documentation is meticulous." Andrew felt a surge of pride and sorrow. Elizabeth's final gift to them was this chance at freedom from fear. Later that evening, settled in a heavily guarded FBI safe house, Andrew helped Grace unpack the few belongings they'd managed to keep with them. The federal protection was a relief, but Andrew remained vigilant, checking security measures and sightlines out of habit. "Do you think it's really almost over?" Grace asked as she arranged her colored pencils on a small desk. "Yes," Andrew replied, with more certainty than he'd felt in days. "Your mother made sure of it." Grace nodded, then hesitated before speaking again. "When you told everyone at the diner I was your daughter, did you mean that?" Andrew knelt to her level, meeting her eyes directly. "Yes, Grace, I meant it. Not just legally, but in my heart. These past weeks, getting to know you, protecting you, it's changed me. If you'll have me, I want to be your father in every way that matters." Grace considered his words with the careful deliberation she brought to everything. "I think Mom would have wanted that," she said finally. "And I want it too." That night, for the first time since they'd met, Grace allowed herself to fully relax, falling asleep holding the stuffed elephant Andrew had retrieved from the farmhouse before their escape. Watching her peaceful breathing, Andrew made a silent vow that she would never again know the fear and instability that had defined her young life. Outside their window, FBI agents maintained their vigilant watch, but inside, something precious and fragile was taking root. A family forged not through blood, but through shared loss, danger, and the enduring legacy of a woman who had loved them both. 1 year later, autumn leaves again carpeted the paths of Harbor View Cemetery. Andrew Collins walked the familiar route, but this time not alone. Grace held his hand, her steps matching his, no longer the wary child he'd met at this same place 12 months before. She wore a purple sweater, the one with subtle sparkles he'd insisted on buying during those first uncertain days together. Her hair was neatly braided, and she carried a carefully arranged bouquet of white lilies mixed with wildflowers, a deliberate combination honoring both sides of her mother's life. "Do you think she knows?" Grace asked, looking up at Andrew. About everything that happened? I believe she does, Andrew replied, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. They approached Elizabeth's headstone, recently modified to read Elizabeth Wilson Collins, with the dates that framed her too brief life. The dual surname acknowledged the truth they had come to accept. She had been both women, living divided but authentic lives. Grace knelt to place the flowers, her movements reverent but no longer heavy with grief. Andrew stood behind her, watching as she traced the engraved letters with her fingertips. "Hi, Mom," she said softly. "A lot has changed since last year." Indeed it had. Lancaster was serving 3 consecutive life sentences, his organization dismantled, his political connections exposed. Chen had been convicted of conspiracy and obstruction of justice. The evidence Elizabeth had meticulously gathered had proven even more extensive than they'd initially realized, revealing a criminal enterprise that spanned decades. More importantly, Grace now had a permanent home. The adoption had been finalized 6 months earlier on her 9th birthday. The mansion had transformed from Andrew's solitary refuge into a vibrant family home, with Grace's artwork hanging in honored places beside valuable paintings, her laughter filling rooms that had stood silent for too long. "I think she'd be proud of us," Andrew said, placing his hand on Grace's shoulder. Grace nodded, standing to rejoin him. Around her neck hung Elizabeth's locket, now containing a tiny photograph of the 3 of them, a carefully edited composite Andrew had created from separate pictures showing the family they might have been. "I'm starting to forget what her voice sounded like," Grace admitted, a note of guilt in her tone. "That happens," Andrew assured her. "But you'll never forget who she was, or how much she loved you." They stood in companionable silence, each lost in private memories of Elizabeth. The pain had softened over the past year, making space for understanding and even forgiveness for the impossible choices she had made. "Ready?" Andrew asked finally. Grace nodded, taking one last look at the headstone. "Goodbye, Mom, we'll come back soon." As they walked toward the cemetery gates, Grace asked the question that had been on her mind. "Do you think she meant for us to find each other? Or was it just chance?" Andrew considered this carefully. "I think she hoped we'd never need to meet. That would have meant you were safe. Lancaster was no threat. But I also think she created connections between our worlds, left breadcrumbs we could follow to each other if necessary. The locket, the cabin, the safety deposit box, they were insurance not just against Lancaster, but against you ever being truly alone." Grace absorbed this, nodding slowly. "So finding you was her final gift to me. And finding you was her gift to me," Andrew replied. At the cemetery gates, Andrew's driver waited with the car. As they approached, Grace looked back at the peaceful grounds where their journey together had begun. "I used to hate coming here," she confessed. "It felt like the only connection I had left to Mom. But now you carry her with you," Andrew finished. "In who you are, in what we've built together." Grace smiled, a full, unguarded expression that had become more frequent as security and stability replaced fear and uncertainty in her life. "Let's go home, Dad," she said simply. The word still created a warm expansion in Andrew's chest, a healing of the void Elizabeth's death had left behind. As they drove away from the cemetery, Andrew realized they had each found something they'd thought lost forever. Not just a replacement for what they'd had with Elizabeth, but something new and equally precious. A family chosen through love, strengthened through adversity and built to last. Elizabeth would have approved.